Chicago, 1997. A beloved high school teacher and her young daughter vanished from their own home. With no forced entry, the police immediately suspected the husband, a man whose life was shattered by the accusation. For 53 agonizing days, he fought to clear his name and find his family, never knowing his wife was a prisoner in her own house, her captor, a former student she had once tried to save. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The red brick bungalow on Chicago's South Side was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the life that Monica and Eric Reed had so carefully and so lovingly built together. In the autumn of 1997, that sanctuary was in full bloom. The scent of Monica's famous chili often wafted from the kitchen, a warm, welcoming aroma that greeted her husband and 2 children at the end of a long day. The walls of the living room were a chaotic, joyful gallery of school art projects, a testament to the creative spirits of 12-year-old Marcus Jr. and 8-year-old Maya. It was a house filled with the sounds of laughter, of spirited dinner table debates, and of the quiet, comforting rhythm of a family in harmony. At the center of this vibrant world was Monica Reed. At 36, she was a woman who had found her calling. As an English teacher at a nearby public high school, she possessed a rare and powerful gift, the ability to see the light in students who had been relegated to the shadows. She was known for her boundless patience, for the extra hours she would spend after the final bell, and for a deep, unwavering belief that there was no such thing as a lost cause. She didn't just teach literature. She taught her students to see themselves as the protagonists of their own stories, capable of overcoming any obstacle. This philosophy was the guiding principle of her life, both in the classroom and at home. She was a builder of people, a nurturer of potential, a steady, compassionate anchor in a world that was often turbulent. Her husband, Eric, was her perfect counterpart, a successful architect with a keen, logical mind. He was the man who gave structure to her dreams. Theirs was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and a deep, abiding friendship. He admired her boundless empathy, and she admired his steady, unshakable integrity. Together, they were a formidable team, a unit that felt complete, safe, and impervious to the harsh realities of the city that lay just beyond their front door. Their life was a beautiful, carefully balanced structure. A life of parent-teacher conferences, of weekend trips to the museum, of quiet evenings spent together after the children were asleep. It was a life of ordinary, profound happiness. A life that was about to be invaded, not by a faceless monster from the city's dark underbelly, but by a ghost from Monica's own compassionate past, a former student whose gratitude, over the course of a decade, twisted into a dark and suffocating obsession. The end of the day was Monica's favorite time, a sacred interval between the demands of the classroom and the joys of her family. The walk from the bus stop to her house was a short one, just a few tree-lined blocks, a peaceful transition that allowed her to shed the skin of Mrs. Reed, the teacher, and become mom again. On this cool, overcast Tuesday in late October, she was walking with her daughter, Maya, their hands clasped together, their conversation a light, cheerful melody of a mother and child recapping their day. They were just a few houses from their own, the familiar, welcoming sight of their front porch in view, when a figure stepped out from behind a large, overgrown hedge. At first, Monica didn't recognize him. He was a man in his mid-20s, thin and pale, with a nervous, awkward energy. He was dressed in nondescript clothes, a man who seemed to blend into the gray afternoon light. "Mrs. Reed?" he said, his voice a soft, hesitant murmur. Monica paused, her mind quickly cycling through the hundreds of student faces she had known over the years. And then, it clicked. The shy, downcast eyes, the way he held himself, as if he were trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. "Daryl?" she said, a warm, surprised smile spreading across her face. "Daryl Jennings. My goodness. It's been, 10 years? How are you?" He had been one of her students, a quiet, struggling boy in her 9th grade math class, a class she had co-taught as a student teacher. He had been a lost cause to most, a kid who was failing, who never spoke, who seemed to be slipping through the cracks. But Monica had seen a flicker of potential in him. She had spent extra time with him, had encouraged him, had told him that she believed in him. A small, grateful smile touched his lips. "I'm okay, Mrs. Reed. I saw you walking, and I wanted to thank you. You were the only one who was ever nice to me back then. I never forgot that." "Oh, Daryl, that's so kind of you to say," Monica said, her teacher's heart swelling with a familiar, gratifying warmth. This was why she did what she did. For moments like this. "This is my daughter, Maya," she said, gesturing to the small, quiet girl at her side. Daryl gave Maya a quick, shy nod, but his eyes immediately returned to Monica, and in them she saw an intensity, a focused, almost feverish adoration that was unsettling. "I was wondering," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Could I just have a minute of your time? There's something I need to show you. It's important. It's about your husband." The words were a sudden, jarring, and completely unexpected shift in the tone of the conversation. "My husband?" Monica said, her smile faltering, a flicker of confusion and a new, cold sense of unease starting to form. "I don't want to scare you," he said, his voice now a conspiratorial hiss. "But I've seen things. He's not who you think he is. I have proof. It's in my car, just around the corner. Please, Mrs. Reed, I'm just trying to protect you, just like you protected me." The story was bizarre, nonsensical, but it was delivered with such a fervent, desperate sincerity that Monica was, for a moment, thrown completely off balance. Her instinct, the one that had always guided her to help the struggling, the troubled, was at war with a new, primal instinct that was screaming at her that this was wrong, that she was in danger. Before she could process the conflicting signals, before she could formulate a response, he moved. It was not a sudden, violent lunge. It was a quick, almost apologetic gesture. He lifted his jacket, and there, tucked into the waistband of his pants, was the dull, gray, and undeniable shape of a handgun. "Please, Mrs. Reed," he whispered, his eyes pleading, but the gun a cold, hard period at the end of his sentence. "Don't scream. Just come with me. I'm rescuing you." The world, which had been a safe, familiar, and sunlit place just moments before, suddenly fractured. The beloved teacher, the compassionate soul who had spent her life fighting for others, was now in a fight for her own life and for the life of the small, terrified child whose hand she was clutching like a lifeline. Eric Reed loved the quiet of his house late at night, after a long day at his architecture firm, a day of meetings, of blueprints, of the controlled, logical world of lines and angles. The silence of his home was a kind of music. It was a silence filled with the soft, sleeping breaths of his children, with the faint, comforting presence of his wife, Monica, reading in the room next to his. It was the sound of a life that was perfectly, beautifully, and safely in place. On this Tuesday night, the silence was different. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was a dead, empty void. He had gotten home from a late, unavoidable client dinner a little after 10 p.m. He had expected to find Monica on the sofa, a book in her lap, waiting up for him. But the house was dark. The living room was empty. At first, there was no alarm. Just a mild, fleeting sense of disappointment. He assumed she had gotten tired and had gone to bed. He walked quietly up the stairs, shedding his suit jacket. He peeked into his son's room. Marcus Jr. was fast asleep. He peeked into Maya's room. Her bed was empty. A small, cold knot of unease began to form in the pit of his stomach. He walked to their own bedroom. It was empty. The bed was still perfectly made from that morning. Monica was not here. He went back downstairs, his footsteps now louder, more urgent in the silent house. He called her name, the sound a sharp, anxious bark in the quiet. No answer. The rational explanations began to crumble. He called her best friend, who hadn't heard from her since that morning. He called her sister. Nothing. He looked at the kitchen counter and saw her purse, her keys, her wallet. She had not gone out. The unease was now a full-blown, suffocating panic. His mind, the logical, methodical architect's mind, began to race, trying to construct a scenario that made sense, but there was no scenario. A mother and her 8-year-old daughter do not simply vanish from their own home on a Tuesday evening, leaving behind their keys, their purses, their entire lives. He ran outside, his heart hammering against his ribs, and scanned the dark, quiet street, as if he could will them to appear out of the shadows. The street was empty. The neighborhood was asleep. His call to 911 was a masterpiece of forced, desperate calm. He was an architect. He was a man who built things, who solved problems. He was trying to report a problem to the people whose job it was to solve them. He explained the situation, his voice a tight, controlled monotone that belied the raw, screaming terror that was consuming him. His wife, Monica, and his daughter, Maya, were missing. The response was swift, but it was not the response he had expected. He had expected a team of concerned, efficient professionals who would share his sense of urgency. But the first uniformed officers who arrived looked at him with a kind of polite, professional suspicion. They saw a man, alone in a house, reporting his family missing, and they saw a house with no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no signs of a struggle. The case was quickly escalated to the Violent Crimes Division. The detective who arrived was a man named Stan Kowalski, a weary, cynical veteran with eyes that seemed to have already seen the end of every sad story. And as he walked through the pristine, undisturbed house, and as he listened to Eric's frantic, but strangely coherent, account of the evening, Kowalski's own internal narrative began to take shape, a narrative that was tragically and devastatingly familiar. A husband comes home late. The wife and child are gone. There is no sign of a break-in. In Detective Kowalski's long, bitter experience, this equation almost always added up to one simple and ugly answer. The husband was not a victim. He was the prime suspect. The accusing gaze of the system had found its focus, and Eric Reed, a man who was already living his worst nightmare, was about to discover that his hell was only just beginning. Detective Stan Kowalski was a man who believed in patterns. In his 25 years with the Chicago Police Department, he had learned that human tragedy, for all its emotional chaos, tended to follow a set of predictable, almost mathematical rules. And the disappearance of a wife and child from a home with no signs of forced entry was a pattern he knew all too well. It was the classic, textbook opening to a story of domestic violence, a story that usually ended with a confession, a shallow grave, and a husband who had finally snapped. His investigation into the disappearance of Monica and Maya Reed was, from the very beginning, filtered through this dark, cynical lens. He saw Eric Reed not as a grieving father and husband, but as a suspect who was putting on a very convincing performance. He saw Eric's calm, logical architect's mind not as a sign of his character, but as the mark of a cold, calculating killer. His initial interviews with Eric were not fact-finding missions. They were interrogations, designed to poke holes in his story, to find the one small lie that would unravel the entire, carefully constructed facade. "So, you and your wife, you got along okay?" Kowalski asked, his voice a low, casual drawl, as they sat in the Reed's own, beautifully decorated living room, a place that now felt like a stage set for a tragedy. "No problems? No arguments?" "We had a wonderful marriage, Detective," Eric said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and a dawning, horrified comprehension of what he was being accused of. "We were happy. Everyone says that, Mr. Reed." Kowalski sighed, as if the answer was a tedious, predictable line from a play he had seen 1,000 times. "But what about last night? You came home late from a client dinner. Anyone who can verify that?" The questions went on for hours, a slow, grinding process of insinuation and accusation. Kowalski's team of detectives descended on Eric's life, tearing it apart with a professional, dispassionate efficiency. They subpoenaed his phone records, his financial statements. They took his car, his clothes, his computer. They treated him not as a partner in the search for his family, but as the sole obstacle to solving the crime. While the full weight of the Chicago Police Department was focused on building a case against him, the real predator, Daryl Jennings, was a ghost they weren't even looking for. He didn't exist in their narrative. He didn't fit their pattern. The story that Kowalski's investigation began to leak to the media was a simple, compelling, and utterly false one. It was the story of a perfect family that was not so perfect, of a handsome, successful husband with a dark secret. The public, fed a steady diet of true crime dramas, was all too ready to believe it. Eric Reed, a man who was already suffering an unimaginable, private grief, was now forced to endure a very public and very brutal trial by public opinion. The pattern, the one that Detective Kowalski so fervently believed in, had taken on a life of its own. It was a powerful, self-perpetuating narrative that was, with each passing hour, leading the investigation further and further away from the horrifying and very simple truth. A truth that was hidden just a few miles away, in the quiet, unassuming house of a former student who had never forgotten his favorite teacher. Monica's new reality was a universe of surreal, psychological horror, a nightmare that was made all the more terrifying by its familiar, domestic setting. Daryl Jennings, in his profound and unshakable delusion, had not just taken her captive, he believed he had brought her home. After the initial abduction, he had not taken her to a hidden, remote location. He had taken her to his own small, run-down apartment, a place that was just a few miles from her own house, but this was just a temporary stop. His true, monstrous plan was far more audacious. A few days into her captivity, in the dead of night, he had forced her and a terrified, silent Maya back into his car, and he had driven them back to their own street, to their own house. He had a key he had likely copied months or even years ago. During his long, silent period of obsessive stalking, he had led them back into their own home, a place that was now an alien, terrifying landscape. The family photos on the wall, the children's drawings on the refrigerator, the familiar, comforting scent of her own life, it was all now the backdrop for a waking nightmare. Daryl's delusion was now in full bloom. He saw himself not as a captor, but as a liberator. He saw himself as the new man of the house, the rightful partner to the woman he had rescued. "I had to save you, Monica," he would whisper to her, his eyes shining with a fervent, terrifying sincerity, as he forced her into the small, windowless storage room at the back of the house, the heavy deadbolt on the outside of the door sliding home with a sound of chilling finality. "He didn't deserve you. He was trapping you in this fake suburban life. I'm the only one who has ever truly understood you. I'm the one who can make you happy." He began a bizarre, grotesque performance of a domestic routine. He would bring her food, not on a cold metal tray, but on her own, familiar, floral-patterned plates. He would speak to her about his day, about his plans for their future. He would sometimes bring Maya into the room to visit with her mother, a cruel, twisted parody of a family gathering. His control was absolute, and it was maintained not by physical restraints, but by the constant, relentless campaign of psychological warfare. His primary weapon was the threat against her children. "As long as you are a good, obedient wife to me," he would say, his voice a calm, chillingly reasonable tone, "your children will be safe. I will take care of them. I will be a better father to them than he ever was. But if you defy me, if you try to scream, if you do anything to disrupt our new life together, I will have no choice but to remove the distractions. Do you understand, Monica?" Monica, the teacher, the woman who had spent her life understanding and navigating the complex psychologies of troubled young people, understood perfectly. She was in a high-stakes, life-or-death chess game with a man whose mind was a fractured, delusional labyrinth. To fight him, to resist him openly, would be to endanger her children, and so she made a decision. She would play his game. She would enter his delusion. She would become the most compliant, the most understanding, the most perfect wife in his twisted fantasy. It was a performance that required every ounce of her strength, her intellect, and her will. Her own home had become her prison, and her own captor, her former student, was now her self-proclaimed savior. The twisted rescue was complete. Daryl Jennings was a ghost who had learned to haunt a house in plain sight. His occupation of the Reed family home was a performance of such meticulous, audacious normalcy that it was almost invisible. He understood that the greatest danger to his secret was not a police raid, but the simple, curious glance of a neighbor. And so, he dedicated himself to the task of making the house look as normal, as occupied, as boringly, reassuringly alive as it had always been. He was a student of the family's routines, a knowledge he had gleaned from years of obsessive, silent observation. He knew what time the lights in the house usually went on in the morning, and what time they went off at night. He would move through the house, a silent, spectral figure, flipping switches at the appropriate times, creating a perfect, hollow illusion of a family still in residence. He knew that the Reeds got the newspaper delivered every morning. So every morning, in the pre-dawn darkness, he would slip out the back door, retrieve the paper from the front lawn, and bring it inside. He would draw the curtains in the evening and open them in the morning. He would occasionally turn on the television, the faint, muffled sound of a sitcom or the evening news, a comforting, domestic murmur that would filter out into the quiet street. He even managed the children. He kept Marcus Jr., the 12-year-old, in a state of terrified, silent compliance through the same, constant threats he used on Monica. He would send the boy to school every day, a silent, walking time bomb, with a chilling, whispered warning. You will go to school. You will pretend that everything is normal. You will tell anyone who asks that your mother is just feeling a little under the weather. If you say one word, one single word, about me, you will never see your mother or your sister again. I will be watching you. The boy, trapped in an impossible, terrifying situation, did as he was told. He became a ghost in his own life, his fear a silent, invisible cage. The house, which had once been a beacon of warmth and life on the quiet suburban street, was now a carefully managed stage set. The lights were on, but nobody was truly home. It was a phantom house, haunted by a living family, its secrets hidden behind a facade of perfect, chilling normalcy. The neighbors, who were already on high alert due to the media frenzy surrounding the disappearance, saw what they expected to see. They saw the lights. They saw the newspaper being picked up. They saw the son leaving for school. They interpreted these signs not as the work of a phantom, but as the actions of a grieving, and possibly guilty, husband, a man who was trying to maintain a semblance of a normal life in the midst of a terrible, self-inflicted tragedy. Daryl's performance was flawless. He was a predator who had not just taken over a family. He had taken over their lives, their routines, their very existence. He was a phantom who had learned to wear the skin of a normal life, a monster who was hiding not in the shadows, but in the warm, inviting light of a family home. For Eric Reed, the 53 days of his family's captivity were a slow, grinding, and very public descent into hell. His life, which had been a testament to structure, to success, to the solid, dependable logic of architecture, was now a chaotic, free-falling nightmare. He was a man under siege, fighting a desperate and very lonely war on two fronts. The first front was the official investigation. He had become the sole obsessive focus of Detective Kowalski and the Chicago Police Department. He was not a grieving husband to be comforted. He was a suspect to be broken. The interrogations were a relentless, psychological assault. They would last for hours, the same questions asked over and over, his answers twisted, his words scrutinized for any hint of a lie. "Where were you really, Mr. Reed?" Kowalski would ask, his voice a low, accusatory growl. "This client dinner. You have a receipt? You have a witness who can place you there for the entire time." He was treated like a common criminal. His house, the beautiful light-filled space he had designed and built with his own hands, was now a cold, sterile crime scene, his personal belongings pawed through by strangers in latex gloves. His office was raided, his computer seized, his business partners and clients subjected to embarrassing, probing interviews. The second front of his war was the court of public opinion. The police, in their frustration at not being able to build a physical case against him, had begun to leak details of their investigation to the media. The narrative that emerged was a toxic and tragically compelling one. He was the handsome, successful architect with a dark side, the man whose perfect life was a lie. His face was on the nightly news, his name a whisper in every coffee shop and grocery store in the city. He became a pariah in his own community. Old friends would cross the street to avoid him. Neighbors who had once been to his backyard barbecues now looked at him with a mixture of fear and a dark, morbid curiosity. He was a monster in a cashmere sweater, a man who had, according to the whispers, done the unthinkable to his own family. Through it all, His love for Monica and his children was a single, unwavering point of light in the crushing darkness. His belief in her, in them, was absolute. He knew, with a certainty that was the only thing he had left to hold on to, that she had not left him, that she would never have left her children. Someone had taken them. And so, in the stolen, quiet hours of the night, after the police had left and the news crews had packed up their vans, he would fight the only battle that truly mattered. He became his own detective. His study, once a place of creative architectural design, was now a war room. The walls were covered with maps of the neighborhood, with timelines, with lists of every person who had had any contact with his family in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. He was a man under siege, his reputation in tatters, his career in ruins, his heart broken. But he was not defeated. He was a husband. He was a father. And he was a fighter. He would not stop until he found his family, and until he cleared his name. The world had branded him a monster, but he was determined to prove that the real monster was still out there, hiding, watching, and waiting. For Monica, the 53 days were a masterclass in the unique, exquisite torture of a familiar prison. Her captivity was not in a cold, anonymous, concrete cell, but in the warm, familiar, and now horrifyingly alien landscape of her own home. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent, invisible witness to the continuation of a world she was no longer a part of. Her prison was a small, windowless storage room at the back of the house, a space that had once been filled with Christmas decorations and old photo albums. Daryl had cleared it out, boarded up the one small window, and had installed a heavy, dead-bolted door. It was her cage, but the sounds of her home, of her life, were not so easily silenced. They filtered through the walls, each one a small, sharp, and beautifully painful reminder of the world she had lost. She could hear her son, Marcus Jr., moving about the house. She would hear the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the faint, muffled sound of the television from his bedroom, the sound of the front door closing as he left for school. Each sound was a dagger in her heart. She was so close to him. She was just a few feet of plaster and wood away from her own child, but she was powerless to comfort him, to tell him she was alive. She could only imagine the terror, the confusion, the impossible, lonely burden that he was being forced to carry. She could hear the sounds of her neighborhood, the cheerful, familiar jingle of the ice cream truck in the afternoon, the sound of children playing in the street, their laughter a carefree, joyful sound that felt like it belonged to another universe. The sound of her neighbor's dog, barking at the mailman. These were the small, mundane, and beautiful sounds of a normal life, a life that was now a torment to her. Her captor, Daryl, was a constant, terrifying presence. His delusion was absolute. He would force her to have dinner with him, sitting at her own kitchen table. The food he had prepared a tasteless, horrifying parody of a family meal. He would talk to her for hours about their future, about the life they were going to build together in this house, once the problem of her husband and her son was dealt with. But in the midst of this unimaginable horror, Monica's teacher's mind, her survivor's mind, was always working. She was a student of her own captivity. She learned the rhythms of the house, the patterns of Daryl's behavior. She learned what soothed him, what agitated him, what sent him into a spiral of paranoid rage. And she began to teach. Her student was her 8-year-old daughter, Maya. In the brief, stolen moments when Daryl would allow them to be together, a cruel, theatrical performance of a happy family, Monica began a silent, secret, and incredibly high-stakes curriculum. She taught Maya the art of invisibility. Through a series of subtle, coded hand signals and quiet, urgent whispers, she taught her daughter how to be silent, how to be still, how to make herself so small and so unthreatening that Daryl would eventually forget she was a danger. She taught her the geography of escape. She would whisper to her about the small, often overlooked bathroom window at the back of the house, a window she knew had a faulty, rusty latch. She would describe the route from that window to the back door of their elderly, watchful neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. A woman she knew sat at her kitchen window every single night. It was a curriculum of survival. It was an act of profound, desperate, and heroic motherhood. She was not just trying to endure her own nightmare. She was preparing her own child for a final, desperate, and incredibly dangerous exam. A test that would, she prayed, be the key to their liberation. For Detective Stan Kowalski, the Reed case had settled into a state of frustrating, low-grade inertia. In his mind, the narrative was clear. The suspect was obvious, but the evidence was maddeningly, stubbornly absent. He was convinced that Eric Reed had harmed his wife and child, had hidden their bodies, and was now engaged in a cold, calculating performance of a grieving husband. But convictions were not built on a detective's gut feeling. They were built on evidence, and he had none. He had thrown the full, formidable weight of his department at Eric Reed. They had searched his office, his car, his parents' home. They had used cadaver dogs to search the parks and the forest preserves near the Reed house. They had found nothing. Eric Reed's life was, to Kowalski's immense frustration, exactly what it appeared to be: the life of a successful, well-respected architect with no dark secrets. The lack of evidence, however, did not shake Kowalski's conviction. It only hardened it. It was, to him, a sign of the suspect's cleverness, of his meticulous, architectural planning. The active, high-priority search for Monica and Maya slowly and unofficially wound down. The case was not officially closed, but it was relegated to the back burner, a cold case in all but name. The file sat on the corner of Kowalski's desk, a thick, silent monument to his own professional frustration. He was a man who was used to solving puzzles, and this was a puzzle that refused to yield its final, satisfying answer. He would sometimes see Eric Reed on the news, at one of the pathetic, sparsely attended vigils he would organize. He would see the man's face, a mask of weary, determined grief, and he would feel not sympathy, but a kind of cold, professional rage. He saw a killer who was taunting him, hiding in plain sight, using his grief as a shield. The system, in its own, inexorable way, had moved on. The media found new, more sensational tragedies to report. The public's attention shifted. The Reed case became old news, a sad, unresolved story that was slowly but surely fading from the city's collective memory. Kowalski was left with a file full of dead ends and a suspect he couldn't touch. His focus, and the focus of his department, had been so absolute, so unwavering, on the husband, that they had become blind to any other possibility. The idea that the truth might be simpler, stranger, and far more horrifying than a domestic dispute was a concept that their pattern-obsessed, cynical minds could no longer even conceive of. The real monster, the quiet, unassuming former student, was a ghost they weren't even looking for. And the real victim was not just the missing woman, but the innocent man who had been so wrongly and so publicly condemned. The official investigation had not just stalled, it had become a part of the crime itself, an instrument of a second, and very public, form of torture. In the suffocating, silent world of her captivity, Monica Reed's greatest weapon was her voice, even though she could rarely use it out loud. Her teacher's voice, the one that could command a classroom, soothe a troubled student, and explain a complex idea with a patient, lucid clarity, was now turned inward. It became the instrument of her own survival, and the tool she would use to forge her daughter into a weapon. She understood Daryl Jennings. She understood him with the sad, tragic clarity of a teacher who has seen 100 broken children pass through her classroom. She saw not a monster, but a deeply, profoundly damaged young man. A boy whose adolescent crush had, in the lonely, empty years of his adult life, metastasized into a cancerous, all-consuming obsession. She knew that to fight his delusion with logic would be like trying to fight a fire with gasoline, and so, she entered his world. She began to use her teacher's skills to manage him, to de-escalate his paranoid rages, to soothe his fragile, narcissistic ego. It was a constant, exhausting, and incredibly high-stakes performance. But her true, secret work began in the stolen, whispered moments with her daughter, Maya. Daryl, in his delusion, saw Maya not as a threat, but as a future, adoring stepdaughter. He would sometimes allow her to be with her mother, a grotesque parody of a family bonding session. In these moments, Monica began her most important and most dangerous lesson plan. She taught Maya a new, silent language, a language of blinks, of hand signals, of a subtle pressure of the fingers. A single, long blink meant yes. 2 short blinks meant no. A tap on the wrist meant be quiet, he's coming. It was a secret, silent dialogue that allowed them to communicate right under the nose of their captor. She created a curriculum of survival. The subject was their own home. She would whisper to Maya about the geography of the house, about the squeaky floorboard outside the master bedroom, about the way the back door always stuck in the humidity. And then, she began to teach the final, most important lesson: the escape plan. The little window in the back bathroom, she would whisper, her voice a soft, barely audible breath against her daughter's hair as she pretended to be reading her a story. Remember how the lock is broken? Remember how we were always going to have Daddy fix it? 2 short blinks from Maya. No. A single long blink. Yes, she remembered. There is a woman who lives next door, Monica continued, her voice a low, steady murmur. Mrs. Henderson. She has white hair, and she sits at her kitchen window every night. Do you remember her? A long blink. If you can ever get out, Monica whispered, the words a desperate, terrifying prayer. You do not run down the street. You do not scream. You run to her back door. You knock, and you tell her one thing. You tell her, he has my mom inside. Can you remember that, baby? Can you be brave enough to remember that? A single, long, and incredibly heartbreakingly brave blink from the 8-year-old girl. Yes, it was a gambit of almost unimaginable risk. She was placing the weight of their survival on the small, slender shoulders of her own child. She was asking an 8-year-old girl to be a spy, to be a soldier, to be a hero. But she knew her daughter. She knew that beneath Maya's quiet, observant exterior, there was a core of her own, fierce and unbreakable strength. The lesson plan was complete. The promise had been made. Now, all they could do was wait for the final, terrible, and hopefully triumphant exam. The promise was a heavy, secret weight in the heart of an 8-year-old girl. Maya Reed, in the 53 days of her captivity, had been forced to grow up at a speed that was both tragic and heroic. She understood, with a child's simple, profound clarity, the game her mother was playing. She saw the way her mother would smile at the monster, the way she would speak to him in a soft, placating voice, and she knew it was a performance, a shield that was protecting them both. And so, she learned to play her own part. She became a ghost in her own home, a quiet, invisible child who never spoke unless spoken to, who never made a sound, who never cried. She held on to her mother's whispered instructions like a sacred text. The bathroom window, the rusty latch, the run to Mrs. Henderson's back door, the 5 crucial words, he has my mom inside. It was a mantra she would repeat to herself, silently, in the long, terrifying hours of the night. Monica, in her own desperate way, was preparing the ground. She began a subtle, psychological campaign to reinforce Daryl's perception of Maya as a non-threat. She would speak of Maya as a shy, quiet child, a girl who was easily frightened. She was carefully and brilliantly crafting a narrative in which the 8-year-old was a broken, compliant, and utterly harmless creature. Daryl, his mind completely consumed by his delusional relationship with Monica, bought the performance completely. He had what he wanted, the woman he had obsessed over for a decade. The children were a secondary, almost inconvenient, part of his fantasy. He saw Maya as a little doll, a quiet, sad accessory to his new, perfect life. He had imprisoned the mother. He had terrified the son into silence. He believed his control was absolute. This arrogance, this profound, narcissistic underestimation of the heart and the mind of an 8-year-old girl, was the fatal flaw in his otherwise meticulous plan. He grew complacent. He would sometimes leave Maya unattended for a few minutes while he was occupied with Monica, confident that the child was too terrified to even move. The signal came on the 53rd night of their captivity. It was late, after midnight. Daryl, in a rare, expansive mood, had been talking for hours about his plans for their future. Monica had been a perfect, attentive audience, nodding, asking the right, placating questions. He was finally, emotionally, exhausted. He had sent Maya to her room, and he was in the living room, watching television, the volume turned up loud. Monica, who had been allowed to use the main bathroom, saw her chance. She walked past Maya's bedroom door, and she gave the signal they had rehearsed 100 times in their silent, secret language. She cleared her throat with a soft, distinct, double cough. Ahem-hem. It was the sound that meant, go. Now. It was a promise, a command, and a prayer, all contained in a single, quiet sound. A child's promise was about to be put to the ultimate, terrifying test. Daryl Jennings's delusion had rendered him blind. After 53 days, his twisted fantasy had become his mundane reality. He had, in his own mind, won. Monica was compliant, her spirit seemingly broken. Her children were quiet, terrified, and obedient. He had successfully replaced the husband, erased the father, and installed himself as the rightful, if secret, king of his new castle. His control felt so absolute, so complete, that his vigilance had begun to fray at the edges. He no longer saw the need for the constant, hyper-alertness of the first few weeks. The house was secure. The family was subdued. The outside world, with its stupid, incompetent police and its gullible, headline-reading public, was looking in all the wrong places. He was safe. On the night of the 53rd day, he was in a state of near euphoric satisfaction. He had spent the evening outlining his future with Monica, a future that involved selling the house, changing their names, and moving to a small, isolated town where they could live out their perfect, romantic destiny. She had listened, her expression one of what he interpreted as rapt, dawning acceptance. He felt a profound, satisfying sense of accomplishment. He was not just a captor. He was a creator, the architect of a new and better world for the woman he loved. He was so consumed by his own internal narrative that he had all but forgotten about the 8-year-old girl in the bedroom down the hall. Maya, the quiet, ghost-like child, was a minor detail, a piece of furniture in the grand romantic set of his life. He had locked her in her room for the night, a routine act of control, and had settled in on the sofa to watch a late-night movie. The volume turned up to a satisfyingly loud roar. He was a man at ease in his own home, a king on his throne. This deep, profound, and arrogant complacency was the perfect, fertile ground for his own undoing. He was a monster who had grown so comfortable in his darkness that he had forgotten that even the smallest, most insignificant of creatures, when cornered, can possess a fierce and surprising will to survive. The evil he had so carefully cultivated was about to be undone by the one person in the house he had never, for a single moment, considered a threat. The house was quiet, the only sound the loud, tinny explosions from the action movie on the television. This was the moment. The signal had been given. In her small, dark bedroom, 8-year-old Maya Reed moved with a silence and a purpose that belied her years. She was no longer a child. She was a soldier on a mission, her mother's final, desperate instructions a clear, unwavering map in her mind. She slipped out of her bed, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. She did not go to her bedroom door, which was locked from the outside. She went to the window. It was an old, double-hung window that overlooked the small, dark backyard. It was a 12-foot drop to the ground below. It was not the escape route. The escape route was the small, adjoining bathroom. It was a Jack and Jill bathroom that connected her room and her brother's, and its door, the one that led into her room, was never locked. She slipped into the bathroom, a small, tiled space that was pitch black. She felt her way along the wall, her small hands moving with a familiar, practiced confidence. And she reached the other door, the one that led to the hallway. It was an old wooden door, and its lock was a simple, push-button one on the inside of the knob. It was a lock that Daryl, in his arrogance, had never bothered to check. She pushed the button. It clicked into place, a small, satisfying sound of a new, and very temporary, security. Now, if Daryl were to try the handle from the hallway, he would find it locked. It would not stop him for long, but it might buy her a few precious seconds. Then, she turned to her true objective. The small frosted glass window above the toilet. It was a window that was rarely opened, a window whose rusty, crescent-shaped latch was, as her mother had reminded her, broken. She climbed onto the toilet, her small, nimble body moving with a silent grace. She reached up and pushed at the latch. It was stiff, but it gave way with a soft metallic groan. She pushed at the lower sash of the window. It was stuck, sealed by years of paint and humidity. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she thought her mission would fail. But then she remembered her father, the architect, the man who fixed things. He had taught her about leverage. She wasn't strong enough to push it open, but maybe she could pry it. She felt along the windowsill. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. A barrette, one of her own, that must have fallen there weeks ago. It was thin, but it was made of steel. It was a tool. She wedged the tip of the barrette into the crack between the window and the sill, and she began to pry, her small hands using every ounce of their strength. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a soft, splintering crack, the paint seal broke. The window was free. She slid it open. A narrow 6-inch gap, just wide enough for her small, slender body to squeeze through. A wave of cool, fresh, night air, the air of freedom, washed over her. The drop to the backyard was a story and a half. It was a dangerous, potentially bone-breaking fall. But there was a thick, overgrown azalea bush directly beneath the window, its dense, leafy branches a potential cushion. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed her body through the narrow opening, her small frame scraping against the rough wood of the window frame. For a single, terrifying second, she dangled, her fingers clutching the sill, and then she let go. She fell, a small, silent shadow in the darkness, and landed with a soft, crashing thud in the heart of the azalea bush. The branches scratched her, but they broke her fall. She was alive. She was unhurt. She was out. She scrambled out of the bush, her heart a wild, frantic drum. She did not run down the street. She did not scream. She followed her mother's instructions. She ran, a silent, barefoot ghost, across the dark, dew-soaked lawn, straight to the back door of Mrs. Henderson's house. She did not bang on the door. She knocked, a soft, urgent 3-tap rhythm they had practiced in whispers. And she waited, her small body trembling, praying that the old, watchful woman on the other side was home and awake. The kitchen of Mrs. Henderson's house was a place of quiet, nocturnal ritual. The old woman, a widow for 20 years, was a chronic insomniac. Her nights were spent in her comfortable, worn armchair by the kitchen window, a cup of chamomile tea in her hand, her gaze a silent, watchful presence on the quiet, sleeping street. She was the neighborhood's unofficial night watchman, a keeper of its secrets, a silent witness to its dramas. The Reed house, next door, had been the focus of her sorrowful, nightly vigil for the past 53 days. She had known Monica since she was a little girl. She had watched her grow up, had attended her wedding, had cooed over her 2 beautiful children. The official story, the one the police and the newspapers had settled on, the story of a domestic dispute, of a husband who had snapped, had never sat right with her. It did not fit the man, Eric Reed, that she knew, the quiet, kind, and utterly devoted father and husband. She had seen the lights in the house, the drawn curtains, the son leaving for school, but something about it felt wrong. The house, which had once been a beacon of warmth and life, now felt like a hollow, theatrical performance. It was a feeling, an intuition, a thing she could not explain, but a thing she felt with the unshakable certainty of her 80 years. She was sitting at her window, lost in these sad, familiar thoughts, when she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from her back door. Her first thought was that it was a branch, blown by the wind. But the sound came again, more urgent this time. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart, a steady, reliable old muscle, gave a sudden, frightened jolt. No one ever came to her back door, especially not in the middle of the night. With a trembling hand, she reached for the small, heavy iron poker she kept by the fireplace. She crept to the back door, her old, slippered feet making no sound on the linoleum floor. She peered through the small peephole. She saw a child. A small, terrified, and heartbreakingly familiar child. It was little Maya Reed, her face a pale, tear-streaked moon in the darkness, her eyes wide with a terror that was so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to radiate through the thick wooden door. Mrs. Henderson's own fear was instantly replaced by a fierce, primal, and grandmotherly instinct to protect. She fumbled with the locks and wrenched the door open. Maya stumbled inside, a small, shivering bundle of raw, unadulterated fear. Mrs. Henderson quickly and silently relocked the door. She knelt down, her old, arthritic knees protesting, and wrapped her arms around the little girl. Maya was trembling uncontrollably. "Child, what is it? What's wrong? Where is your mother?" the old woman whispered, her voice a soft, soothing rumble. Maya looked up at her, her eyes a bottomless, dark pool of a horror that no child should ever have to contain. Her lips moved, but at first, no sound came out. And then, she spoke, her voice a tiny, raw, and incredibly, heartbreakingly brave whisper. The 5 crucial words that her mother had taught her. The words that would blow this entire, terrible case wide open. "He has my mom inside." As a Jensa Vendewert, Mrs. Henderson stared at her, her mind struggling to process the impossible, monstrous statement. The whispers, the police theory, the public narrative, it was all a lie. The truth was a nightmare, and it was living right next door. She did not hesitate. She did not question. She believed the child. She picked up the phone, her hand steady now, her voice a clear, firm instrument of a long overdue justice. She dialed 911, and in a calm, unwavering voice, she told the dispatcher, "You need to send the police to the Reed house on Elm Street. Right now, the little girl is here, and her mother is still inside with the man who took them." The 911 call from Mrs. Henderson was a seismic shockwave that shattered the very foundation of Detective Stan Kowalski's case. He was at home, asleep, when his precinct commander called him, his voice a raw, urgent bark that cut through the fog of sleep. "Kowalski, get down to the Reed house on Elm Street. Now, the daughter just escaped. She says the mother is still inside with a captor." The words were a physical blow. Kowalski sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, his mind a chaotic, reeling mess. It was impossible. It was a delusion. It was a mistake. But he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching, and soul-crushing certainty, that it was the truth. His entire, carefully constructed narrative, the one he had built on a foundation of cynicism and statistics, had just been demolished. Eric Reed was not a suspect. He was a victim. And he, Detective Stan Kowalski, had spent 53 days tormenting an innocent man while his wife and daughter were being held captive just a few miles away. He arrived at the scene to a controlled, tactical explosion of law enforcement activity. The quiet, suburban street was a silent, flashing sea of blue and red lights. A massive SWAT team was in position, their black armored forms a stark, menacing presence in the pre-dawn darkness. The Reed house, the place he had dismissed as the site of a simple, domestic crime, was now the epicenter of a high-stakes, life-or-death hostage situation. He met with the SWAT commander, his own face a pale, grim mask. He provided them with the blueprints of the house, which he had gotten from a frantic and now completely vindicated Eric Reed, who was being held back behind the police line, his face a portrait of pure, agonizing terror. The raid was a swift, brutal, and perfectly executed act of professional violence. On the commander's signal, the team breached the front door with a battering ram, the sound a deafening, splintering crack that shattered the morning's silence. They flooded into the house, their shouts of, "Police, show me your hands!" a cacophony of overwhelming force. Daryl Jennings was caught completely by surprise. They found him in the living room, jolted from a sound sleep on the sofa, his face a mask of pure, shocked disbelief. His secret, perfect, and delusional world had been shattered in an instant. He surrendered without a fight, a pathetic, trembling figure who seemed to shrink in the presence of the heavily armed officers. The monster, without his shield of secrecy, was just a small, sad, and broken man. While one team secured him, another swept through the house, searching for Monica. They found the boarded-up, dead-bolted door of the back room. They broke it down, and there, in the small, dark, and filthy space, they found her. She was huddled in a corner, a pale, emaciated ghost of the vibrant woman she had once been. But she was alive. The words crackled over the police radio, a message that was a pure, unadulterated miracle. We have the mother. She's alive. I repeat, the victim is alive and safe. The reunion was not a media spectacle. It was a quiet, sacred, and profoundly emotional moment in the sterile, brightly lit triage room of a local hospital. When Eric, his name now cleared, his innocence now a stunning, public fact, was finally allowed to see his wife, he saw a stranger. But as she looked up and saw him, her eyes, which had been filled with a deep, ancient sorrow, suddenly lit up with a spark of the old, familiar light. They held each other, their sobs a silent, shared language of a pain so profound it had no words. And then, their two children, Maya, the brave little hero, and Marcus Jr., the silent, terrified survivor, were brought into the room. And the Reed family, which had been so brutally and so publicly torn apart, was finally, miraculously, and beautifully made whole again. The community, the police, the entire city was left to grapple with the horrifying and deeply humbling truth. The monster had not been the husband. It had been the quiet, forgotten boy that a beloved teacher had once, in a life that seemed 1,000,000 years ago, tried her best to save.